Hey everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the final lecture for the causes of the Civil War. We're going to look at how political failure led to the conflict between the northern states and the southern states in the Civil War. The simplest way to sum this all up is that the government had failed. The federal government did not resolve the issue of slavery or bring the nation together. In fact, a lot of the actions of the federal government had caused the North and South to be driven further apart. So the origins of political failure can really be seen in the formation of the government in the Constitutional Convention. The framers of the Constitution avoided the issue of slavery because they didn't want to alienate votes. They didn't want to touch on such a touchy subject. But there are aspects that allude to slavery, and there are parts that both sides kind of looked at in the Constitution to justify their side. So, of course, the Southerners looked at the Three-Fifths Clause, which gave three-fifths of a person to slaves as representation in the government. They saw this as the idea that slavery is recognized in the Constitution. They also looked at the idea of extradition. This is the idea that if you commit a crime in one state and go to another state, you can be arrested and brought back to the other state for trial. So that's how they looked at the Fugitive Slave Act as an issue of extradition, that if a slave ran away, which is illegal in a southern state, that crime still counts in a northern free state and they could bring that slave back. So they used that argument of extradition. They also used the argument of private property. The Fourth Amendment recognizes the right of private property, and so planters and southern slave owners looked at this as a right to own slaves. But then you also look, the abolitionists could find other things that they referred to in the Constitution. They referred to, the framers of the Constitution never referred directly to slaves. They referred to other persons in the Three-Fifths Clause. They never first used the term slave. Abolitionists also looked to the 1808 importation ban, which was the ban on bringing slaves in from Africa. What initially the framers were hoping is the institution of slavery might die out. And so the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and so 20 years later, the importation ban would go in place. And so the framers would really hope that slavery without the importation of slaves, that the institution would die out. But you can see it's really unclear, and this is the beginning of the political failure. The Constitution is also unclear in the point of succession. Southerners looked at the idea of the reserve powers in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution as all powers not delegated to the national government are reserved for the state governments. And so there's no issue of succession in the government, in the Constitution. So the states took it as their view that they have the right to leave the Union. That is a power that's reserved for them. Since they had joined the Union freely, they had the right to leave it freely. However, Abraham Lincoln and the Northerners looked at the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which stated that when there is a conflict between state powers and federal government, between the national government, that the national government is supreme. Lincoln also looked at the idea that seceding from the Union required unanimity, and that is the idea that all states have to succeed. Since only a part of the states are seceding, it requires all states working together. They can disband the Union, but a single state or a group of states cannot. Congress also hides from the issue of slavery. Congress fails to directly address the idea of slavery. Remember, there had been a gag rule put in place in Congress in the 1820s that they cannot even consider laws regarding slavery and regarding the problem of slavery. And so what happens is there's no national laws passed to deal with this. The Congress could have dealt with it in certain different ways. They could have passed an amendment endorsing the idea of slavery, basically making slavery constitutional. That's what John C. Calhoun, famous Southern congressperson, wanted to enact. They could have extended the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise. Remember the line that's set between the North and the South in Missouri. They could extend that across the country, basically creating a line where slavery could either be below or above, creating free states and slave states. They failed to do that. They could also do something like the gradual purchase of slaves back from planters, back from slavery, to kind of have a peaceful way out of slavery. They could have compensated slave owners for their slaves. They didn't address any of these issues. The issues they did address, we've already talked about, and they were failures. The compromises did not unite the nation. They tried to find a way around it without directly addressing the issue of slavery. So the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act failed to solve the problem of unifying the country. The political apparatus also fractured as a result of not being able to come to some form of solution. The Whig Party collapsed as a result of the failure to unite the nation over the issue of slavery. The Whig Party, which had been the big party in the 1840s, collapses by the end of the 1850s because they're unable to unify the Northern and Southern Whigs. In their place, the Republican Party kind of fills the vacuum. The Republicans are a Northern anti-slavery party, so they're kind of filling the vacuum left from the Whigs. But then you still have the Democrats, the primarily Southern party, but they can find no middle ground between the Democrats and the Republicans. And this is really summed up in the Brooks-Sumner incident, in which Preston Brooks attacks Charles Sumner on the floor of Congress and beats him into a coma with his cane, causing brain damage. They got in such a big argument, two politicians, that one of them attacked the other one with a cane and beat him into a coma. So you can see how fractured politics is as a result of these issues. You really see the political fraction even more in the election of 1860. So what happens is Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, is not even on the ballot in most southern states. They can't even vote for Lincoln. They hate him so much. Southerners fear him so much they won't even put him on the ballot. The Democrats are actually split into two factions. The Northern Democrats support Stephen Douglas. You can see he only gets the vote in Missouri and in New Jersey. And then the Southern Democrats support John Breckinridge, and Breckinridge supports the institution of slavery. So you can see Breckinridge wins the Deep South. And then there is actually another party, the Constitutional Union Party, is kind of only wins those states right there in the middle states that are kind of on the issue, the border states there. And they run John Bell for president. He wins those states. So you can see really the divide. The Constitutional Union Party won't last at all. But Lincoln wins all the northern states. You can see the amount of electoral votes. So Lincoln wins the election of 1860, despite not being on any southern ballots. The Supreme Court also failed to fix the problem of slavery in the United States. Of course, their ruling in the Dred Scott case in 1857 only created more problems when they asserted that Congress could not regulate or limit slavery. Basically, the Dred Scott case, which we learned about last time, Southern slave owners could go into northern free states and bring back their escaped slaves. So what this does is technically make slavery legal everywhere. Northern states rejected and challenged the verdict. They thought that this was an infringement on the southern states. But you can see this doesn't solve the problem. The Supreme Court only makes the problems worse. So it could have been up to the chief executive, the president of the United States, to fix the problem, to lead the country away from this problem. However, the presidents of the 1850s were among the worst the country has ever had. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan are the three presidents who led up to Abraham Lincoln, did nothing to address the issue. Most of them just hid out in the White House and tried to avoid the issue directly at all. So they didn't lead at all, and this kind of leads even more to the conflict. But there could be no longer hiding with the presidency, especially with Abraham Lincoln being elected and the Republican Party being the anti-slavery party. So in the election of 1860, this is going to force the nation to deal with the question of slavery and states' rights. Lincoln winning the election brought a powerful, strong anti-slavery candidate into the White House. The election of Lincoln causes fear to grow in the South. There's now a Republican president in the White House. South Carolina and the lower South are convinced that Lincoln will abolish slavery. The Richmond Examiner in Richmond, Virginia, has a headline that a party founded on the hatred of African slavery is now the controlling power. The Charleston Mercury, the headline of their newspaper is the terrors of submission are 10 times greater than the fears of disunion. The idea there that the submission by the Republican Party are greater than the fears of leaving the country. So this is really fear spreading throughout the South. So as a result of the election of 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union in December of 1860 following the election. The lower states follow in line with South Carolina, asserting the right of states' rights. They have the right to dissolve the Union. They went into it peacefully. They can leave it peacefully. They don't want to be part of this country anymore. So the South now sees itself, these red states on the map, now see themselves as not being part of the United States. However, Abraham Lincoln has a different view. Lincoln asserts that secession is unconstitutional. The idea is the Union is unbreakable. As I said, unanimity had to be a cause of breakup. So if every state wants to leave, then yeah, the Union can be dissolved, but not a certain collection of states. The U.S. is a single nation, not a collection of states. And Lincoln is willing to use force to keep the nation together. This is his cause now. He sees it as his cause to keep the United States together. So it will take a couple months after the states succeed for the Civil War to start in earnest. And what happens is the firing on Fort Sumter by South Carolina militia on April 12th and 13th of 1861. Fort Sumter is an island fortress at the head of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and the United States Army had moved its forces there following the Declaration of Secession of South Carolina, and there had been problems with trying to get supplies to them. Since it's in the South succeeded. The United States Army is stationed there. They are having trouble getting supplies to the fort. So what eventually happens is the Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard of the South Carolina militia decides to fire on ships that are trying to supply Fort Sumter, and this leads to counterfire from the U.S. Army at the fort, and they leads to a volley of shots fought between the two. So these are the two sides exchanged fire for about 34 hours, and eventually the United States Army at Fort Sumter surrenders on April 14th following 2 Union deaths. So this is the beginning of bloodshed between the South and the North, between the United States Army and the Southern militias. Lincoln responds to the skirmish at Fort Sumter in his first inaugural address. He states, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine is the momentous issue of civil war." Basically, he's saying this is the South doing this. These southern states who are succeeding are causing a civil war. It's not in my hands. This is in you. You are succeeding. This is not my fault. And Lincoln also issues a call for 75,000 troops to strengthen the Union Army. So he's building up strength. As a result of Lincoln calling the Union Army, the Upper South then succeeds. The Upper South succeeds out of a fear that Lincoln will invade them. These are still the slave-owning states you see in red here. They had not succeeded in December of 1860. However, Lincoln calls his army. They're saying he's about to invade. He's going to take our slaves. We need to succeed and join the other southern states. So in April 1861, the United States goes to war with itself. The Civil War begins. And it's important to remember here, Lincoln's primary goal in going to war is to preserve the Union. Lincoln is anti-slavery, but he is not an abolitionist. He did not run to overturn the institution of slavery. He does not agree with slavery. But this starts to shift throughout the war. And this kind of shifts to the idea of ending slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. But we have to remember that he was going to war to preserve the Union, to keep the Constitution together, to keep the United States intact. So here we have a map of what the country looked like in 1861. You see the blue states are the Union states. You see the yellow states are the Confederate states, and then you have the border states, the green states in between. You can see Virginia is now split. These border states own slaves, but they do not succeed with the other southern states. So they not become part of the Confederate States of America. But these areas will be really conflicted, and we'll see how this conflict plays out as we go into our section on the Civil War.